Hello, everybody. I promised ages ago that I would do a test lecture for you and that I would put it on my channel. But obviously life gets in the way of things. I'm trying to get better at uploading regularly to YouTube. So actually what I've done is I've put all of your everything that everyone tweeted at me, I've put it into a nice little document here. And I thought I'd just go through and do it like a kind of a Q&A. So without further ado, I've got Martin Phillip at Plex Netflix. He says, no point asking about the pedestrianization of Norwich Town Centre then. Well, I did ask what topic would you like me to give you a lecture on? And as it happens, I do have some very deep thoughts about Norwich Town Centre, which I actually had to Google the pronunciation of. And I think, you know what, the main thing is they really need to build kind of a super highway so that all the poor bastards living there can get out, from what I read on Google. Consider the Owl says, how about something on debt and affect? Oh, actually, I thought you were asking me to consider owls, because I have lots to say about the snowy owl. No, kidding. Okay, so debt and affect. My guess would be that that's something like the mental health implications of debt. I really don't have a huge amount to say about emotion in terms of how people actually experience it in their everyday lives. I mean, that's something that's quite interesting, and a lot of people do a lot of research on that. Obviously, what my research looks at is how emotion functions in public discourses. And so when it comes to things like debt, and I'm actually quite wary of how it's increasingly being seen as a mental health problem, how economic problems are increasingly seen as mental health problems. Because what I think that does is it says, like, these things, it's not bad enough in itself. You have to turn it into a health problem, right? With like everything, at the end of the day, what makes it bad is that it's bad for our health. And it really like compounds the fact that health has become the ultimate value in society. What about freedom? What about the fact that debt enslaves you and says that you can't do very much with your life? Isn't that bad enough? We should ask ourselves, why do we not find that a convincing enough rationale? Why do we have to turn everything into a mental health issue? Obviously, it feels terrible to be in debt. Like it's awful. But if you define a situation as essentially about mental health, and the solution is about mental health, and in fact, there are a ton of interventions. You know, it's a great industry. You know, mental health support for those who are economically struggling. Well, if you define it as a problem of freedom, well, you need to free people from those debts. Daniel at Alacrites, terrible, Ashley. Do you have any thoughts on syndicalism? Years ago, I remember that a friend of mine was an anarcho-syndicalist, and I had a lot of things to say about that. But honestly, I don't know enough to have anything really interesting to add. David Winters at dwinters123. Police power and contemporary Marxist theories of the state. Okay, I'm not really familiar with the contemporary literature on the role of the police in the capitalist state. Obviously, if you go back to Lenin, State and Revolution, it's quite clear that the police are the sort of one of the armed bodies of the state. And I always like the line from State and Revolution where his like proof of the fact that the state is not your representative, but is actually an organ of oppression. It is it enforces the oppression of the ruling class over the working class. He says that if, you know, the working class were to organize and have a military, it would fight against the state. It wouldn't like just happily join the state. And you can see that in terms of the history of partisan armies and how they've been gradually, or they were forced to disarm, you know, and so that the state has a monopoly over violence, and therefore, you know, that violence is often used to enforce class rule. And an example that I used to always give is if a company knowingly releases, you know, tainted food into the market, and people get sick and die, and then a bunch of people organize at the company offices and protest, who do the police protect? The protesters or the company office. Obviously, it's going to be the company office. Okay, so Fragments of Joe, that's at Fragments of Joy, I think, got cut off. I work in an area of change, so something on how people react to change would be good. I don't think that there's any specific way that all human beings will react to change all over the world. It really depends on the culture that you're in. And one thing that I've noticed about our culture is that there's a tendency to see change, at least in sort of public discourses of social problems. Change is always seen as a precursor of some problem, either a mental health issue. So the assumption is that human beings in general just don't deal with change very well, that change is a problem that needs to be managed. But in fact, I mean, if you look throughout history and cross-culturally, how people deal with change depends on how it's made sense of culturally. So there are, people, cultures that live on the brink of what we would think of as disaster. So they, live in areas where there's frequent flooding. Perhaps they live on the edge of a volcano or something like that. And they aren't basket cases worrying about risk and so on, because they have cultures in which those threats make sense, and they're able to make sense of them within the symbols and meaning systems that exist in their culture. So I would say that how people deal with change is culturally specific. And in my book, my first book, I talked about how the problematization of happiness often winds up as a critique of change, in the sense that you see this kind of idea over and over, and it's not just in happiness discourses, but you see it in mindfulness discourses as well. This idea that we just want to stop the world and get off, like live in the moment, which is impossible. If you think about time, like, where's the moment? It's passing. Time is always moving. Society is always changing. And we now live in a time where change is seen, as I said, as a precursor of something bad. And so we just want to kind of stop the world and get off, freeze history, go back to the past, or sustain the present indefinitely. And I think that's a product of the loss of future-oriented thinking, the loss of utopia, the loss of any sense that human beings can create a world and a future that's better than today. And actually, this thing about change, it reminds me of, that essay from Walter Benjamin that was made famous, I think, by Zizek, where he says, where he describes this Klee painting of, the angel of history. And there's this wonderful line in that essay, which is so much quoted, and for good reason, where he says, there's where we perceive a chain of events. He sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. The storm is what we call progress. And I feel like that's kind of the feeling that a lot of us have, where we see the destruction that progress appears to bring, and we want to stop. We want to go back to the past. We want to resurrect what's dying or dead, but we can't. It's not an option. There's a very good line from the Grundrisse where Marx says, "It is as ridiculous to long for that original fullness as it is to imagine with this complete emptiness all history has come to a standstill." You can't fight change. You can't stop history. You can understand it and try to bring it somewhere good. Try to allow the forces of history to take us somewhere better. And we can fight the degradation of life by having a more optimistic understanding of progress. Only human beings can do that. There's no point in trying to basically say, stop the world, I'd like to get off. It's not possible, and I don't think it's desirable. The next question that I got is from Christopher Harrison at Christo21232328. Very good creative name. Something on the Frankfurt School. I didn't know they had schools in Frankfurt. It's interesting about the Frankfurt School. I think a lot of Marxists cut their teeth on the Frankfurt School, and I was similar. You know, I was very attracted to that line of thought, and that's initially what attracted me to Marxism when I was an undergraduate, 19, 20 years old. And I recognized that obviously, like at the level at which you dip into critical theory at that point, it's not that deep. For me, it was really out of this sort of countercultural kind of impulse of rejecting the culture industry and the degradation of and the fakeness of everything, and just this search for authenticity and that kind of thing. And actually, so that was my pathway to reading Marx's work in the original. And actually, what I found when I did that was I was quite surprised to find that, at least how I was reading Marx, and what the bits that I had chosen to read at first, how much they differed from what I thought that he was going to say. What I had this image of what Marxism was about, and I really didn't find that. So I think the very first thing I ever read was what the first thing that everybody reads, which is the Communist Manifesto. Although I think I read his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right before that. But the thing that I probably read in depth first was the Communist Manifesto. And I was just surprised at what I saw as a very, I kind of thought of Marx as like more of a romantic kind of thinker. I thought about I thought of Marxism as something like what is really sort of utopian socialism. And also I was very interested in Hegel at the same time. And so I feel like that I found dialectics easier to understand because I'd come from being very interested in Hegel's ideas of history, obviously to the extent that you can be as an undergraduate, and not a particularly bright one. But, and what I found in Marx was much more of a progressive kind of thinker, someone who wasn't just rejecting capitalism, but was rejecting capitalism in favor of something higher. It wasn't just like reject it, destroy it, tear the whole thing down. It was understand it. And all of his work basically was about trying to understand what capitalism is. And there's so precious little of drawing up these blueprints for socialism or communism. And because you need to, in order to make history, you need to understand it. We must make history in the full light of reason. And so I feel like the Frankfurt School kind of is in some sense is a wrong turn for the left, for what became of Marxism, or what today is understood as Marxism. And I think it's the excessive kind of cultural focus. And there's a very good essay by Alan Freeman that describes the Frankfurt School's relationship to Henrik Grossman, and how they more or less consciously suppressed his ideas. They really had, they were very disparaging of Grossman. They called him economistic, that he had this sort of excessive kind of positivism. He committed the cardinal sin of positivism. And, but I think, Grossman was closer to the heart of Marxist theory than I think the Frankfurt School was, in that he was trying to understand the forces of capitalism in order to understand where it's taking us, and it's scary that it appeared to be taking us nowhere good. And I think history has shown that he's correct. Whereas if we let go of understanding the economic base of capitalism, we've essentially damned ourselves to fighting a never-ending culture war. Everything is just downstream from culture. And so instead of seeing culture as a reflection of something deeper, we see culture as causing something deeper. We see culture as causing the perpetuation of an economic system. And I also think that the use of cultural theory and cultural criticism to explain why there was no revolution, and to say, oh, well, the workers were just bought off, they were duped, at the end of the day became a critique of the working class. I think it's Lenin's obituary of Engels, he talks about how at the time that Marx and Engels were writing, most people were horrified by the growth of the working class. They were disgusted by it. And he says, on the contrary, Marx and Engels grew more and more optimistic the more it grew. They put all their hope in the working class. Who's like that now? Who really has faith in the working class now? Now we just think it's the working class's fault that we're still in this situation. Instead of taking a long, hard look at ourselves and our politics and asking, why did my ideas fail to convince people? Why am I not offering something that's capable of exciting people? And really having a long, hard look at ourselves, which I think we need to do. Like, if we want to change the world, we need a good portion of the world on side. So you need to ask yourself, what am I offering? What am I offering that's better than today? If you want to say like, oh, it's to make people good and better, and it's for the betterment of your soul. Well, look, capitalism wants to do that too. It's constantly sneering at people's consumption. Look at your smoking and your drinking. Follow me, and life is going to be worse. Nobody's gonna do that. And capitalism's already doing that. It wants the workers' bodies to be ripe for exploitation. So it's always there, haranguing workers, telling them how they could think, how they should behave, how they should feel. We need to have a movement that has faith in everyday people and that seeks to convince them and sees them as people who can be convinced, people that need to be excited about a future that's better than today. And I think that excessive focus on, pop culture and, language, although, I also do this, I focus on culture and so on and language. And I do find it difficult to extricate myself from accidentally saying that culture causes everything. And I do try to dig down to what that culture is reflecting instead of seeing culture as causative of something. And I do recognize that I am kind of in that quagmire myself, but I do think it's important that we don't let go of the economy side of things, that we do try to understand what capitalism is in order to find a path out instead of excessively focusing on culture in isolation. So that's my mini lecture on what I think of the Frankfurt School. Now, obviously, there's a lot of really good stuff in there, and I'm just going to wave my hand and say it's all junk. But I do think that just generally that whole suppression or turning away from the economy side of things, and general kind of move toward cultural criticism, I think in general is being the wrong turn. At Dead Bug says, I would love to hear what you have to say about the relative possibility of ethical consumption in different political, cultural, and economic structures. And he or she starts with Queen. I have never been called that, and that is a feudal throwback. You should be ashamed of yourself. No, I'm kidding. It's Your Majesty. So I think that ethical consumption is, to a certain extent, it's never going to solve problems. It's just a way of saying, like, Zizek's famous line, just like you can have your coffee without caffeine, you can have your capitalism without its destructive essence. And I think that's basically the case for ethical consumption. There is no way to produce commodities within capitalism without exploitation, because if you want to survive as a capitalist, you need to have a certain amount of surplus value that you extract just to be able to plow back into production, never mind, buying your yacht and all that stuff and having your reward for your investment. So I think that it's an attempt to try to overcome the contradictions of capitalism ideally. So you can tell yourself, I'm not really part of this. I'm not those stupid people who are buying that junk. I'm spending a little more to have my products ethically produced. And of course, this just it's a sort of romantic anti-capitalism. So it's this attempt to overcome capitalism through trying to get in touch with a deeper kind of feeling, or a moral critique of capitalism. What we need instead is an economic critique of capitalism that avoids, to the extent that it's possible, excessive moralism. I think that the way out is not to make things nicer, but to understand that there are contradictions within the system that can never be overcome, and will produce worse and worse crises, will produce more and more human suffering, regardless of how nice capitalists are, they are forced to, on pain of extinction, to extract surplus value, to exploit people just in order to survive. No amount of niceness is going to fix that, because the problem is much deeper. At Ortega Breton says, do something on responses to coronavirus, differences in risk perception and attitudes toward risk. Like, I found trying to respond to coronavirus to be really, really difficult, because obviously the situation is changing and developing every day. And typically when you do sociology of risk, you're always talking about people overblowing risk. And I feel like in this situation, it's hard to do that because it just seems to be getting worse. And so I've been really reluctant to say anything. I mean, I did a stream with Doug Lane a couple of weeks ago, and even the things that I said there, a few days later, I just thought, I don't think that anymore. I kind of disagree with myself now. So it's really difficult. But one thing that I have noticed that's really interesting in terms of responses is how this tendency in the culture to see people as children, and those in power like to be like parents, and the electorate and the masses as children. So initially, when the UK government gave the advice regarding social distancing before the lockdown, it wasn't totally clear what we were or were not supposed to do, and kind of what the end goal was. And so that weekend, there were all these images of people in parks. Well, look, no one said that you couldn't have a picnic. And why couldn't you if you maintain social distancing? Now, I think at that time, people weren't doing that. But, there's a difference between, simple messages and just a game plan that had no clarity to it. I think just the plan itself was problematic at that time. So then they said, people need simple messages. People need unambiguous messages. And so they've come up with this new thing where it's like, stay home, save the NHS, save lives, that kind of thing. And no sense of why. And now, okay, for a child, you need a simple message. Don't do this, do that. You need to tell children unambiguously what they're supposed to do. But an adult, and also some children, will say why. Why? We are able to think for ourselves. And I feel like that's creating a lot of frustration, because there are a lot of people who are saying, just do what you're told, stay home, just do what you're told, just do what you're told. And there are people who are like, well, what I'm being told doesn't make sense. Why can't I walk my dog in the Peak District where I'm miles away from any other person? If the point of the rules is to ensure social distancing, then shouldn't I be able to do that? If I go to the park and I maintain the proper social distance, should I not be able to do that? And if there are good reasons why you shouldn't be able to do that, perhaps that should be something that is outright said, instead of you have all these sort of like post hoc rationales for why an elderly person who was caught, on a drone, walking his or her, I think it's his dog, out in the middle of nowhere, and everyone's shaming this person. And it's like, well, there's no chance in all hell that this person is going to spread the virus. And go, oh, well, you could get into a car accident. Well, you people, you selfish people, how dare you shower? Don't you know how many people slip and fall in showers? Like, it makes no sense. People are able to assess risks for themselves. And I think a lot of people are getting frustrated at that fact, but that's kind of what people do in a modern developed society where we have access to a huge amount of information. We are trying to risk assess for ourselves. And I think also a lot of these, I have this slight sense that a lot of these post hoc rationales for why you can't walk your dog in the middle of nowhere are because probably it's really quite nice. And I think that there is a tendency in the culture now, this sort of like puritanical tendency to say, like, if you're outside, like no one should be seen outside of their house enjoying. Like, you must not enjoy. In order to take this seriously, you need to have the right affective orientation to being outside. You should look miserable, and if you're doing exercise, it should be exercise only for a stipulated amount of time, and you should not be enjoying that exercise. You certainly should not be sitting and soaking up the sun. And I think it's because we have this idea, you must not enjoy. And I think that's part of it. And I don't want to take this to crazy extents, but it's interesting that part of the slip into fascism is a war on enjoyment. And what you get and where you get your enjoyment is from certain like state sanctioned activities, but that's taking it a little bit too far. But I do notice that there is this, and this is always the issue within, health, with risk and health. It always has this ambivalent relationship toward freedom and enjoyment. And you can never say like, yeah, I smoke because I like it. There's no argument that can be made for freedom because health has supplanted every other value that we have in our culture. And when you want to justify something, people will say, well, it's good for your health. And I've noticed that when people are justifying, like, because we don't know when we're going to be out of lockdown. All right, if it's just for like 4 weeks, okay, we'll suspend our standard of living. We'll suspend our, what's the word I'm looking for? Like our enjoyment in life and that kind of thing. But if it's going on indefinitely, there's no clear end point. You can't suspend people's like quality of life forever. So I think this is part of the issue is that health moralism always has an ambivalent relationship to enjoyment. And I think I'm seeing this a lot with the response to coronavirus. Someone named Messi_Marxist at Messi Marxist says, can you explain Hegel? LOL. Yes, LOL indeed. No, I can't explain Hegel. Can anyone explain Hegel? Honestly, I think there are some ideas within Hegel that I find particularly important. And I think I've been reading a tiny bit of Hegel for a long time. I've not read like his complete works like Marx did. But it's funny because I will often dip in and out of Hegel's writings and will remember absolutely nothing. But the way that Hegel functions for me is like in Futurama, those little aliens that kind of sit on your head and force you to think in particular ways. That's kind of how I think of Hegel. Like it infects the way his work infects the way that I think, and it just becomes the way that I think about things. And I'm just going to eject my dog from my room. Dog, be gone, go, get out. See, my dog's name is Marx. And that's Marx's way of telling me that I'm misinterpreting Hegel. So I think one of the most important ideas that I take from Hegel is this very progressive idea of history, and I think that's encapsulated in this idea of becoming. That it's very difficult to think about a moment in time or to think about anything in isolation, and the idea that change is the nature of reality. And once you grasp that, I think it blows open so much of our attempts to, like, for instance, definitional sociology, where you think that you start out by defining something and you hold up that definition as an ideal, and then you go out to reality and you see reality doesn't fit that ideal, and you just get really mad at reality instead of thinking about, well, how is a concept changing over time that tells us something about the world, right? So I see in, like, with happiness research, a lot of people would say, like, they would take some ideal definition of happiness, like Aristotle, like eudaimonia or something like that, and they will say, well, that's the true meaning of happiness. And then they'll go into culture and see all these different things. And they'll say, oh, see, look, it's being degraded. Instead of saying, like, well, how is the culture changing that the meaning of that term changes, right? So you study the forces of historical change in order to understand something about the way that society is changing, or the forces of cultural change in order to understand the way that the society is changing. And so this idea of, like, permanent change and flux is really important, I think, from the main thing that I take from Hegel. But, Hegel's like this, I find, like, dialectical thinking is always, I'm never really able to explain it, but it has become just the way that I think about things. And I think that's kind of common to a lot of people who read Hegel and then read Marx. It just becomes part of the way that you think. And I think it's very hard to read and understand Marx without that underpinning, because otherwise you can be tempted to just reject things. You just see cultural criticism as a rejection, or criticism of capitalism as a rejection, instead of seeing it as a process of becoming, and pointing out how the contradictions in history are moving us toward something else. And the goal is to understand, what is that something else? How can we control that? Can we control that? And, that's what I think you get from sprinkling a little bit of Hegel into Marx. There was a question about the birds of Botswana. Actually, my favorite bird of Botswana must be the lilac-breasted roller, who may have better hair than I do. There are two questions that are very similar. Someone asked me to talk about media-induced anxiousness and depression. A very similar one about abundance and availability of information negatively impacting on the mental health of kids. I think these are really, really complex topics. Again, I don't think there is a one-to-one relationship between our exposure to something and our anxiety from it. Like, the famous example is that, in the past, public executions were a form of family entertainment. You would have seen death and dying as a normal part of life. My grandmother used to tell this story about obviously living on reserve in the 1930s. They were very, very poor. And she was holding her baby sister in her arms, and the baby just fell back and died. And that was like, she told the story like very matter of factly. And people will say like, oh, she's repressing things. Well, no, I mean, like, death was a fact of life. And also, we have a very different understanding of death. Like, nobody ever really dies. So anyways, I'm not going to get into that. But I mean, it depends on your culture and depends on how you make sense of things. And I think in our culture, we have this paradoxical understanding of risk and panic. So actually, I think panic is, and worry and anxiety to a certain extent, is something that is condoned by the culture and is seen as something that's quite good. You're supposed to worry about. As a good citizen, you're supposed to be always thinking about your health. You're supposed to be always focused on being healthy and eating the right things and avoiding risk. As a mother, as a parent, your job supposedly is to know of and avoid any and all risk. And I'll tell you, like, I am a mother and I am a basket case when it comes to thinking about risks. Why? Because people think that it is my responsibility. It's the responsibility of us parents to post some flippin' awful story on Facebook about some infinitely small risk of some horrible thing happening. So now I'm terrified that I'm going to like blank out and leave my kids in a hot car or something. Oh God, this gives me anxiety just thinking about it. But why would you post something like that? Like, because it is my responsibility as a good person. You should be aware of this. And everyone should know, leave your handbag in the back seat so you'll never leave your kids in the car. And my husband, who's not a basket case, I would say to him, like, I was seriously, like, I read this story. Why did I read this story? Why did I click the link? I read the story and it seriously damaged me. I fully understand why you would be anxious. Reading this kind of stuff, if you're aware of any and all tiny little risk and you're supposed to worry about it, yeah, man, you will be damaged. I read this awful story and I said to my husband, like, I'm terrified. Like, I'm so that kind of person that I get lost in thought all the time. I'm afraid I'm going to hurt our children. He looked at me and he was like, you're not going to leave our children. You're not going to forget about our kids in the back of a car. Like, that's not going to happen. And it just the matter of fact way that he was like, this is the most tiny risk in the entire world that you're worrying about here. But, our culture kind of encourages that you're supposed to be aware of these risks and you're supposed to be anxious about them. And then they look around and go, oh, gee, everybody's so anxious. Wonder why that is. Well, it's encouraged. You're supposed to be aware. You're supposed to tell children about all of these risks and tell them that these are very serious times and you should be worried. The world's going to end like tomorrow. Yeah, of course kids are going to be worried. I'm going to try my best not to tell my kids about that. My daughter knows, for instance, my 3, almost 4-year-old daughter knows that there's a virus. And every morning she wakes up, and the first time that she did this, she woke up, she says, Mommy, is there still a virus? And I said, oh God, my husband and I have been talking about it and she must have heard and she must be very worried. And I started to think in my mind, like, okay, how am I going to explain this and alleviate any fears she might have? And I said, yes, honey, there's still a virus. And she goes, yay! She starts dancing. I was like, so, and she goes, that means that you and daddy are going to stay home and play with me all day again. And I just realized, like, that's her world. She doesn't need to know this whole other world of anxiety. That's my world. And it's not my responsibility to put that on her. Let her be a kid, you know? So I try not to give her this vocabulary of anxiety and risk and so on, although I suppose it's inevitable. But we see it as our responsibility to be aware of and worry about absolutely everything. And then we're surprised when people get very anxious. I mean, I think it's not an inevitable outcome of our relationship to a risky world that we worry. In fact, I think that in many ways, perhaps not right now, but in many ways, modern life is a lot less risky than has ever been the case. You know, your risk of dying as a child, as a young adult, is very, very small, perhaps smaller than it's ever been. The vast majority of people can expect to live into their 70s and 80s utterly for the first time in human history, at least in rich Western countries. And yet, paradoxically, we're much more worried about our health than has ever been the case. You know, when death was lurking behind every corner, people didn't really worry about dying as much as we do now, or people didn't worry about their health nearly as much as we do now, because health was not something that had to be pursued and thought about, and through this kind of risk awareness and being aware of anything that could possibly hurt you. It was more something you just had when you weren't sick. And so that's gone now. And so I think in order to understand fear and anxiety, you need to understand it in its cultural context. I'm going to have to just probably do one more. And I think I'm going to go with Tom Knox. He says, I'd really love to hear your opinion on the causes behind the recent polarization of politics, especially hot topics, like how minority voters in the Western world aren't prepared to believe that the majority voted against them anymore, and how people aren't prepared to consider any opposing political views to their own in debate. In general, I think polarization of politics isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think it's good to have disagreements. For a long time, politics was very bland. We had the middle way, which is, as Daniel Bell famously said, it's for the middle-aged, not for the young. And there was nothing exciting about politics. You know, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that was it. It's the liberal democratic consensus. Tweak a little bit here, do a little bit of things over there, and this is it. This is the end of history. Now we've kind of reached the end of history, and we're seeing a return of politics. But what I find interesting is the way that some sections in society seem to be dragged kicking and screaming back into politics. And so, for example, looking at the Labour Party in the UK, you can kind of see them like digging through the dustbin of history, looking for something, kind of unprepared for the way that politics has reinvigorated itself. And by that, I'm kind of alluding to Keir Starmer. And this, I feel like it's this idea that, look, we need to go back to some time when everything was certain. It wasn't so risky, like Corbyn saying all these risky things and, talking about socialism and being too radical. Let's go back to this nice, comfortable time when we had Tony Blair, who was talked and never really said anything. and Starmer is perfect for that. It's PR. It's fantastic PR. Let's go back to that comfortable time when no one ever swore on TV like Donald Trump does, and that's basically a retreat from politics rather than an embrace of the return of politics. I feel like we need to just understand that the old ways were not working anymore. And when voters reject that, it's not because they're stupid. They are hitting on something important. They are not convinced. They want something else, and we are not offering it. So that's all I've got time for. Thank you so much for your suggestions. Hopefully you'll be seeing a lot more of me on the Zero Books channel as well, and on this channel too. Hopefully we'll do this again sometime. So if there's something that you want me to talk about, just send me a message on Twitter. I've got to go because there's screaming kids downstairs and a husband who's forgotten what I look like. So bye-bye.